say what percentage, but when there's a recovery, then the hospital bills Medicaid, and so it increases their cap for hospital authority funds because Medicaid picks that up.
So when a refund comes back, that's credited back into the taxing authority to be used for other funding.
Well, for the hospital or wherever that claim of recovery might have occurred, whether it had been at a clinic or with specialty care, and most of them occur at the hospital level.
So you typically earmark that then for the entity in which the recovery is made from?
Right.
Okay.
But you did tell me before, I think, that there was a $4 million cap applied to each hospital, or just
no, but contractually, when the hospital was sold, the indigent care that we were supposed to provide contracted every year was $4 million, and then there's been it's adjusted annually for increase in CPI index, and so now because of that, over the years, that amount last year, that amount in the budget was $5,385,000. That's where it's gone.
What is your firm's role? What are they paid to do this? I'm seeing a gray area between the county and the contract administration and some of the TPA's functions. Is that very clear?
The TPA is, I mean, we work with them, but we're not affiliated with them,
right?
And they're a different entity. So what we do the monthly bookkeeping, we pay the bills, we prepare the budget, we meet monthly, we go to the meetings, we transcribe the minutes. Somebody calls up the hospital authority, our phone rings, because we don't have what was formerly an office for the hospital authority is now being used for primary care clinic. In addition to, we fund quite a few little medically healthcare related nonprofits. So the total dollars is really not significant, but administering all those little contracts, that takes time. We do the trim process. When the independent auditors come in, we present them a financial statement to audit. So, and then there's a lot of, kind of unexpected things that come up, and whatever falls within our purview, we do, because in essence, we are the hospital authority, or our office is.
No need for that executive administrator.
Well,
you're fulfilling that role totally.
We're fulfilling that role, and we thought, or what we saw is that to get the skill set that you would need to do everything that you're endeavoring to do with employees might be difficult. And like I said, back when they didn't have employees, employee and a half, that was the total personnel back then was maybe $75,000 or $80,000 a year with benefits, but yet still all these outside services were being contracted out, although the executive director, she did do some testing of the hospital claims, which back in those days were presented on an Excel spreadsheet, and she would sample them and test them for correct amounts and so on and so on.
And you said you only have one entity that was at the TPA that was interested in this and fulfilling this role?
That's the only one we could find back then. And I don't know what else is out there now. We've been happy with what we ended up with.
I assume your firm bills on an hourly basis for this?
We have a contract for the administrative part and the accounting part, two separate contracts, and it's an annual contract. And then if it looks like we're going to go
kind of on an hourly basis. We do state that we cap it at a certain dollar amount, and if it looks like the time necessary is going to exceed that amount by either 10 or 15%, depending on which contract I'm looking at, then we would go back to the board for additional approval. We have never gone to the board for additional approval in the last 5 years that we've been doing this, but we do kind of try to give you an idea that it will be so much an hour. However, there is a cap on it, and if it takes more than that, then we would have to come back for additional time. But it is all based on a hourly rate. That way, if you don't need that much services, it doesn't cost you as much, or if you have a lot of additional activities, a lot of research involved with some special project you decide to do, then it could be more. So it fluctuates based on our hourly rate.
Is it appropriate to ask you what that rate may be, or what that contract annually may be for the 2 contracts?
Absolutely. Where's our budget here? Okay, the general accounting contract, which is the bookkeeping, the check writing, preparation of monthly financial statements, and those type of things, processing the checks, all of the accounting type functions is $45,000 per year is what we've done as a cap. That's our budget. We charge based on our standard hourly rate for the different category of the person doing the work. So it could be anywhere from $85 to $175, depending on what service is needed, who's doing the work, those type of things.
Is that actual dollars? If your hours come in less than the $45,000, is that what you bill, or do you bill at $45,000?
We would bill less.
Okay.
We would bill actual dollars as opposed to the cap. So that is the accounting side of things. The administrative side of things is billed at the budget is $62,000. Same type of deal. The hourly rate applies. If at the end of the year the hours are less, you would have been billed less than the total cap. The administrative includes everything from transcribing the minutes, going to meetings. There's it's a citizens advisory board that helps rank a lot of people that are requesting funding.
The nonprofit.
As Alan said, there's a lot of additional funding that we do to nonprofits that provide medical or medical-related services. There's a separate citizens advisory board that meets periodically throughout the year that analyzes these groups and does their ranking in order to determine who they think is eligible for funding. So the administrative involves going to those citizens advisory committees, handling public records requests, any phone calls that come in, preparing minutes, preparing the agendas for the meetings each month, basically anything administrative would go under that.
What are the number of medical facilities that you negotiate with? How many are out there?
Here in this chart. We do have a big flow chart in your packet. I hope it's kind of laminated. On the right-hand side, it says other funded agencies. This is a list of them: the SMA Crisis Center, the House Next Door, Mental Health, Healthy Communities, Good Samaritan Clinic, which is primary care, but there's also a dental clinic with Good Samaritan. Volusia County Health Department, prenatal services. There are several others. This is started in 2009 and 2010 was the last time we updated this chart. And so tonight we're just here to kind of give you an idea of what we do. We didn't go through the extra time to redo that. However, each year it opens up for any agency in the community to submit a bid. The Council on Aging is another one where they provide. They've just applied to get some funding to assist with different programs that they offer. So there's probably at any time there's about, I was going to say 8 or so different funding agencies. As far as those applying to get funds every year when they analyze it, there's probably about 12 to 15, maybe. Some of them don't qualify just because they don't meet the medical need requirements based on our charter. But there's reasons for not getting funding. But those are all ranked by the Citizens Committee.
We also are responsible for we're responsible, each hospital district in our county, and we have 3 in our county, but are responsible for paying not the nursing home Medicaid claims, but anything other than nursing home, and that comes through the county, so we're involved in that part too. We are also responsible for HICRA, which is the Healthcare Responsibility Act, and those are, if you're a HICRA hospital, you can submit claims to the various hospital authorities, and each hospital has a certain rate, so we're involved in that too. So we cover a lot of different areas.
The TPA and then your fees and everything, if I just did quick math, it comes up to $822,000. Are there any other expenses that are hard dollar costs before it gets to the patient?
Whatever the tax collector and property appraiser charges you. I mean, with us, that's pretty substantial. We've got $485,000 budgeted for that. Yeah, percentage of.
What is our percentage of administrative versus medical claims? You show it every month.
Oh, it's about 4%.
Right. Our administrative costs total run about 4% of the entire budget in a given year.
That's not counting TPA.
I believe that's probably, I think we're not counting the property appraiser, because I believe we show that. Each board meeting, we have a pie chart showing how much goes to health care and how much the other segments are costing. So but TPA is included in admin in that.
That 4% is TPA, admin, and accounting.
Mr. Chairman, the legal fees, did I miss that?
The legal fees are, what we have in the budget is $60,000. And there's some other small things like the independent audit that's budgeted at $15,000. We are still responsible for, we haven't had to pay any of all, but we are still responsible for tailing workers' comp claims back when we actually own the hospital. So we do have something budgeted for that, but I think that's about over with.
How does this affect providers' workload to provide these documents?
They submit that, I mean, it seems to go, I think it's a pretty smooth process, but they submit this electronically through a portal, and I mean, I suppose this is a very common way of submitting security documents these days.
The one benefit of having this health card, though, is it is eligible for 6 months. It's good for 6 months. So if I went to the doctor today, and then I went again next month for some reason, I could show my health card, and it would cut down on them having to come up with these documents every visit that somebody attends. So that's where some benefit comes in. The providers, they want to get reimbursed, and the only way to get reimbursed is to provide documentation to prove that the patient was in the actual zone, the district that they're trying to get money from, and lived in that district. And also they have to prove that they're eligible, because contractually by law you have certain parameters you have to follow before you can reimburse somebody. So providers are providing that information anyway. By having the health card, they only have to do it once every 6 months per person, as opposed to every visit. So that is why we are a strong proponent of having a card and having a limit, and you can decide whether it's 4 months or a year or 6 months, but having some type where they have to reapply because people can gain employment or better employment and maybe not be eligible in the future, or people might be eligible at some point. So it does fluctuate, but at least there's a 6-month window where they can get those services, and it would not cost the providers as much as if they had to make sure if someone's eligible every single visit they come in.
Where's the liability reside? In liability, I mean, with the TPA?
If they're approving somebody that's not
Yeah.
eligible.
Have y'all run into that?
Well, in theory, the liability would probably reside with the TPA. However, it doesn't even get to the TPA unless one of the providers believes that they're eligible. So it starts at the provider level, the hospital or the clinic, and if somebody clearly doesn't qualify, they don't even get to the TPA level. So it starts at the clinic or the hospital, and then it goes to the TPA. So the TPA is kind of the auditor of this process. So I guess technically if it got past them, but you do have somebody submitting claims that believes that they're eligible, and a second person who is overseeing that and verifying that, yes, this looks like an accurate claim. So the TPA would probably be the ultimate.
Thank you.
Do you have any other questions for these gentlemen? Hearing none, thank you very much for your time and your comments.
We appreciate the opportunity to be here, and you know, if you have any questions, we certainly be endeavor to get you an answer. But we found that this system has worked well for our hospital district, and we feel like there's much more accountability than it was in the past.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much, and feel free to stay and listen to the rest of it if you want. You probably won't fall asleep. Just kidding. I guess the next part is, and again, I may want to get into the document that I forwarded to you that is entitled North Lake County Hospital District Recommended Procedures. And after I sent that to Ms. Kersey, I asked her, I said, should I take that out, take out the word recommended, because it's not a recommendation, it's just, here's something that we can start with. We had nothing before, so we're trying to give you something that you can consider, and this would be maybe an alternative, or you'll see that many of the procedures that are currently being followed by the West Volusia Hospital Authority are intertwined in this document as well. And it starts with the funding procedures and gets into how the dollars are going to be allocated. And I think that's obviously a question that everybody has. It was one of the first ones that I came up with. Okay, how do we, ahead of the game, or ahead of the at the beginning of the fiscal year, how do we determine who's going to get what? And the current method of distribution is first we account for the budget, the operating expenses for the district, and they're netted from the proceeds, from the estimated tax proceeds for the fiscal year. And then those funds have historically been divvied up on a per capita basis between the Northeast and the Northwest districts. And I believe that's I may be off a percent here or there, but I think it's been about 46% to the Northeast district, which LRMC serves, and about 54% to the Northwest district, which Waterman serves. Am I close? Or is it opposite? Opposite? All right. The districts are wrong? All right. Yeah, Leesburg's in the west, northwest, and Waterman's in the northeast, but the percentages are correct. Waterman receives 54% and Leesburg receives approximately 46%. Of that amount, of those amounts, 5% has historically been given to LifeStream Behavioral Center. And there's been no other provision for other providers under the old method. This new legislation obviously gives us some discretion as to how the funds can be allocated. It specifically identifies the acute care hospitals that reside within the district. It also mentions the other freestanding or licensed primary care clinics within the district, and I believe it also identifies the mental health hospital. All right. So in this process, it's been about a month since we met, and I met with all representatives from all the entities, or had conversations with them over the phone, some many times. They're probably tired of hearing me calling. And it was suggested that until we have a year under our belt, maybe let's go forward with a similar allocation for this first fiscal year, assuming the tax is levied, and we haven't made that decision yet, so let's go ahead and get that out on the table. I'm not assuming that we're making the distribution or levying the tax, but I just, for purposes of conversation, let's assume there is a tax levy. The recommendation was, let's take the net proceeds after the allocation to cover the operating expenses. 90% would be divvied up between the two acute care hospitals in a similar fashion that has been in the past on a per capita basis. So of that 90%, 54% to Waterman, 46% to Leesburg. 5% of the same amount that LifeStream had been receiving will still go to LifeStream, and 5% has been allocated to or been made available for other licensed primary health care clinics. And those might be the two clinics that are currently being supported by the hospitals. It could be individual providers, it could be other organizations that are licensed as primary care clinics. Those dollar amounts, essentially the additional 5% that's going to those licensed primary clinics is going to come out of the pockets of the hospitals. I've been told that and read that property values are expected to decrease by about 5%, anywhere from 4 to 5% this fiscal year. The county is currently in their budget process and trying to cover a 5% hole or lower revenue. So the tax dollars in our budget for this past year was amounted to about $8.6 million net. Those were the budgeted amounts that were budgeted to go to the hospital. $4.7 million to Waterman and $3.9 million to Leesburg. And I did a big calculation that I took that number, assuming that the number stayed the same, which we think is going to go down by 4 or 5%. But taking that number times 90%, and I get $7.77 million. 54% of that number is $4.2 million. And try to keep these in mind, if you would, be write down $4.2 million for Florida Hospital Waterman and just under $3.6 million for Leesburg. LifeStream would get around $388,000, and there would be a similar $388,000 that would be available to licensed primary clinics. I also thought that, or had thought that this new legislation has significantly tightened the restrictions or the requirements, criteria, whatever you want to call it, for a person to be considered an indigent. No longer are Medicaid, unreimbursed Medicaid costs and unreimbursed Medicare costs or bad debt included in the computation. It's essentially been identified as those patients that would otherwise qualify under the HICRA guidelines, which are very stringent. First, they have to be residents of the district, and they have to meet the requirements of the HICRA law, or HICRA guidelines. And there are very specific guidelines that oppose to income and assets. The only exception being that the HICRA guidelines, I believe, limit income to 100% of the federal poverty level, and our legislation increased that to 200% of the federal poverty level. So other than that, they're all essentially the requirements are the same. And by that I mean these gentlemen were referring to the eligibility documents that are provided to all the folks that apply for indigent status in Volusia County. And included in your package is a list of those documents that are allowed under HICRA guidelines, and you'll see that they've been duplicated into the proposed legislation or the proposed rules and regulations that are before you. There's lists about 8 or 9 different documents that are acceptable to document residency. There has been some concern that, you know, some of the folks that our providers see are homeless and would have difficulty providing documentation showing where their residence is. So HIPAA guidelines require that absent any of the 8 or 9 specific documents that are listed in their guidelines, that an affidavit or a declaration by the patient indicating that they have no residence or they're in a certain spot, it has to be accepted. So again, that I think is included in there as well. There are asset limits. There's certain income that's included, that has to be included in the computation. There's asset limits. You get to exclude your homestead if in fact you own a home, and you can exclude a vehicle, one vehicle. If you have multiple, you can. And certain types of things like that. There are limits on the asset that an individual can have and also still qualify for indigent status. So what I asked the hospitals to do was that we had this huge number that was presented to us in years past that supposedly represented their costs, their indigent care costs, including all the other items that I mentioned before, the Medicaid, unreimbursed Medicaid and Medicare, bad debt, and the charity care that we're talking about now. By narrowing those criteria, can you go back and scrub your data for 2011 and come up with an estimated cost of those procedures, assuming the new requirements were in place that year? You know, can you come up with a number for me to see, to show me, you know, where you think you would stand? And you remember that Waterman, number on the computations that I just went through, they would be getting an estimated $4.2 million, and you have to consider there may be a reduction in the number because of the reduction in the real estate values. Their number amounted to about $5.3 million. And again, that was going back, looking at last year's charges, trying to use the same criteria. So they exceeded their number by over $1 million. The number that we had come up with for Leesburg, under my estimation of revenue distribution next year, would be about $3.6 million. Their number was right at just in excess of $4 million. So they too are estimating that their cost under the new system would still exceed the amount of tax revenue that would be received. And they're both of the opinion that, you know, obviously that number, that calculation is not scientific. They didn't, you know, they did the best they could using the systems that they had. They are aware that they're going to have to come up with more documentation, you know, for audit purposes and what have you. So they feel like that once those procedures are in place, or those rules are in place, that they believe that the numbers that they provided me are going to be conservative estimates. They think that those cost dollars, the dollars of indigent costs, would be in fact higher. I actually had a conversation with Mr. Wiener from Livestream. He estimated that he gave me the charges that they had incurred for a Medicare or for indigent costs last year, and applying their cost to the payment to the cost to charge ratio, it worked out to about $1.3 million, and they're going to be receiving just under $400,000, $388,000 under the, you know, if in fact we go forward with this recommended process. So I wanted to be able to, and I did provide copies of those documents as well in my email that was forwarded to you yesterday, so you have that information in front of you. It has it broken out between inpatient and outpatient and by hospital, so you should have that information available, and you can do your own computations and crunch the numbers any way you like. And there's also a copy of the HIPAA eligibility determination guidelines, and I believe we also included a copy of the guidelines that were provided to us from the West Volusia Hospital Authority, which I believe was duplicated in the package that they brought tonight. So, you know, with that, I wanted to at least describe or explain the first section. It's section 1.0 in the recommended procedures portion, as to how those those suggested allocation percentages were derived. The next section, 2.0, provider procedures, identifies, and it's this language that's basically taken right out of the legislation. Service received was medically necessary, and that's something we probably need to talk about as well, as to how we audit that. I think the legislation requires a certification from the providers that the procedures were medically necessary, but again, that's something for discussion and consideration among the board. Reside within the North Lake County taxing district within the boundaries defined within the bill. Household gross annual income less than or equal to 200% of the most recently published federal poverty level. Patient not eligible to participate in any other government program that provides necessary care. So that essentially precludes Medicaid and Medicare patients from being a part of the system. Patient has no private insurance or inadequate private insurance as defined by the following. Patient's gross annual income is less than 200% of the most recently published federal poverty guidelines, and the amount of charges due from the patient exceeds 25% of the annual family income. There says the provider will submit a certified detailed summary list of qualified patients receiving care. And there's obviously some concern with regards to HIPAA laws. We don't want to, I don't think we want to touch, I don't think individual patient information needs to be disseminated amongst the board. I think the recommendation was that there is a list where there's a patient number assigned to the qualified patients that are identified by the hospital, and there's a list of charges, and there's a list estimating or identifying the cost associated with those charges, and also the Medicare reimbursement number for those charges. And the legislation allows us or provides for the lower of cost or Medicare reimbursement to be the maximum amount that can be refunded or be reimbursed to the hospital for provision of indigent care. So what is envisioned is a list of patients identified by a patient number with that information as to their charges listed there. And that would be provided to, and again, this is where we have to make a decision whether we have our own in-house staff, whether we contract with a third-party provider, a third-party administrator, or whether we contract with an agency, a CPA firm, or whomever, someone else, an independent third party to go in and do the audit on these things. The numbers that were provided to me by Waterman for 2011 suggested about 6,500 encounters. Is that correct? Am I using the right term, encounters? Not necessarily patients, but encounters. I assume that number is going to be very comparable on the Leesburg side, and then there's probably 1,000 or 2,000 Howard on the live stream side. I don't know. So just those three hospitals alone will result in about 15,000 encounters that are going to be submitted as documentation for or as proof of incurring these indigent costs. It would be ridiculous to assume that we're going to audit every one of those. There are industry standard procedures for auditing, in not just healthcare, but in other industries as well, where a representative random sample is taken, maybe 50 or 100 items or whatever, and detailed audit procedures are gone over. They go to the individual providers, get the documentation that they had acquired for that individual, and look at it to determine whether in fact it does in fact meet the requirements of the legislation. And if there's problems with the documentation it's kicked out, or it may require, if there's a significant number of errors, that maybe expand your sample, and then if it's pervasive, then you have to look at something, doing something different. Maybe there's a percentage that we apply and say that these are automatically not qualify or whatever. But assuming that the documentation is in fact appropriate, we get the certification. We have agreed upon procedures with whoever's doing the audit. They come back and say that we've done the sample. We believe that the documentation is adequate, and we go forward in that list or that quarter, and we can do this on a quarterly basis. I don't know that it's necessary to do it monthly, but we then have that quarter of the year is complete, and then you get a similar list for the next quarter, and those lists are required within 60 days of the end of the calendar quarter for us to be available to be audited. So those are the basic premises, I guess, of Section 2. You see that under 3-A or 3.A, the list is required within 60 days of the end of the quarter. B, the information that is required on the list itself, and the fact that the provider will be maintaining documentation for each qualifying patient to be made available for us to audit. 3.0 is acceptable supporting documentation, and there is where you'll see the information that looks very similar to what's in the HIPAA guidelines. First of all, in the first section it says documentation to support the following 3 eligibility requirements. That's per terms of the legislation: proof of residency, identification, and income. Proof of residency, and it shows 9 different items there, specific items, and then the 10th one that I added was the declaration by the patient if they don't have any of these other items available to prove where they live. And again, under HIPAA, I've been told that under HIPAA guidelines that is a requirement. Identification, you see that there are several items there, 6 different items there that will qualify for identification. And then income, the first 12 items talk about what would be sufficient in terms of what needs to be considered as income, and documentation of each one of those would have to be included in the packet. And then item number 13 are a list of assets that need to be considered as well. Determining Medicare reimbursement and costs, section 4.0. This is where it gets complex. And I'm glad I have hospital people here in the audience in case I need it. It says that the following procedures will be put in place to ensure that qualified indigent care allocation provided to the acute care hospital does not exceed the lower of actual cost of care or Medicare reimbursement. District designee will use industry standard statistical sampling techniques to identify population from the certified detailed listing to review documentation in support of tax district eligibility. In accordance with Section 3, this document will be made available to the district designee. For outpatient claims and other claims where Medicare reimbursement is unavailable, Medicare reimbursement will be determined by using the Medicare payment to charge percentage attested to in the last as-filed Medicare cost report. The as-filed Medicare cost report is reviewed by the Medicare fiscal intermediary on an annual basis and attested to by the chief financial officer of the hospital facility. Indigent care cost will be determined by using the cost to charge percentage attested to also in the last as-filed Medicare cost report. And this is where it gets a little difficult if you're not in the healthcare industry to really get a good understanding. There are different reimbursements for inpatient versus outpatient charges. It would be virtually impossible, I think, to have a patient walk into the ER or present themselves, or even just admit into the hospital, regular admit, that was determined to be indigent, and then to be able to follow them around, during their 2 or 3 or 4 day period, or 5 or week or 2 weeks, and actually count costs or identify costs that are associated with each patient. So, as I understand it, there is a Medicare cost report. There are allowable costs that Medicare allows to be considered as reimbursable costs, and at the end of the year, those are tallied up. They're compared to the charges that are charged by the hospital, and you develop a cost-to-charge ratio. So for every procedure and I'm assuming that there are similar profit margins or markups or whatever in each one of these procedures, or the charges, you assign that percentage. If a patient is identified as indigent and they incur $20,000 worth of charges, but their the cost to charge ratio is, say, 30%, so 30% of that $10,000 will be identified as the cost associated with the provision of these services to the indigent. We have to compare that cost number to the Medicare reimbursement rate, and this is also where it gets confusing, at least for me. Their DRG, and I forgot what they stand for already, but they're diagnostic something, whatever. Yeah, they are applied primarily for the inpatient services, and then there are a different set of charges that are applied to or considered for outpatient services. So there will be a way their system will identify the Medicare reimbursement for the services that are provided, and those will also be included on the list that's provided to our district designee to provide the audit service. So that's where the numbers are, presumed to be coming from, and are made available for audit. The TPA service that was talked about by the West Volusia folks, it may or may not work. There are some definite differences in how we operate. We are proposing the recommended procedures also try to take into account the allowance within the legislation for the district or for the hospital to participate in the Medicaid matching programs that are offered through ACA. These documents, or the list of charges of approved or indigent charges that are submitted, or costs that are submitted, will document that the costs have been expended. But rather than paying the hospitals directly, we would divert those funds to ACA, like we do now, to go into the matching program, the Medicaid matching program, and as the hospitals bill ACA for Medicaid patient reimbursement, they get the funds back that way. So it's essentially the same way that we're currently operating, but it does in fact allow the hospitals to participate in a matching program that's significant. I've been told that the current programs may not be around much longer. We may end up reverting back to the lower income pool program next year or the year after. But I believe that the buyback program and the self-exempt program, maybe at least the buyback program, is available this year, and that's the one with the big match. I mean, the hospitals almost double their reimbursement by participating in those programs. So, with that, I apologize for rambling on, but I just wanted to give a brief overview as to how this recommended procedures document was derived, so you get an idea of how we could proceed. Again, we've got the option of going with in-house staff, going through a TPA, or hiring a vendor, an outside vendor, or a CPA firm, or some other audit firm to actually come in and do the work for us on a quarterly basis. So, with that, I'll open it up for any comments or questions by board members.
Will you run that by me again, the payments to ACA for Medicaid? Tell me about that again.
The documentation for the indigent care costs will be provided, and I believe that the West Volusia folks have mentioned the same thing, that the contract that we entered into, first of all, in order to participate in the matching program, ACA requires the money to be received directly from the tax district. It can't come from the hospital. So we have to divert the funds away from the hospital. The old legislation allowed us, said that we were to send the money as directed by the two recipients that were named. The new legislation allows us to participate in the programs, in the same matching programs, so it's going to require that the money go directly from the tax district to ACA, to Tallahassee. And I believe it's done on a quarterly basis, 2, 3, or 4 times a year? 4 times? 4 quarterly payments. And if we're receiving $8 million or $9 million in tax, I mean, a lot of it comes up front. I'm not sure if they're equal payments or not. but it's a fairly large lump sum that goes up there on a quarterly basis. And the comment that was made by the folks in West Volusia was that when we make the first payment, we may not have actually incurred, or the hospital may not have actually incurred within that fiscal year enough cost to cover that first payment, but over the course of the year, they will catch up and probably surpass that number. So the payments go directly to ACA. They match it with the federal funds, and then the hospitals are billing Medicaid services provided directly to ACA, and ACA makes the reimbursement back to the hospitals.
But we're not covering Medicaid. Am I missing something?
That's right. They're documenting costs of indigents, and and like I mentioned before, they were the estimates for 2011 were $5.3 million by Waterman, approximately $4 million by Leesburg, another $1 million, 2 or 3 by Livestream. So combined, we're looking at over right at 5.3, 4.9, a little over $10 million, $10.5 million. So we're documenting $10.5 million worth of costs that were expended on indigent care. All right, they're saying, don't pay us directly for those costs because we want to participate in this matching program for Medicaid. Instead of paying us and reimbursing us directly for these costs, send those funds to Tallahassee because we want to participate in this other program that pays extra dollars, helps us increase our reimbursement for Medicaid patients. So we're not paying for Medicaid costs. I mean, we're taking that pool of dollars that has been justified by the list that they're providing for indigent care that was provided. We're just sending the payments to a different location as they direct.
Is there any way that you can provide that to us in writing so that we can follow that?
We'll have a transcript.
I mean, you know, that is kind of complicated.
I don't know if there's something that would be available from one of the hospitals that they have.
I just want to say you did an excellent job.
Did I?
Now you understand the hospital.
Yeah, if I ever lose my job at the bank, I'll be coming to you guys, right?
You did an excellent job.
Well, thanks. And yes, Fran, come up, please. This is Fran Trump, the CFO for Waterman. I don't know if maybe we can contact ACA directly about the Medicaid program. I don't know.
Francis Crunch, Florida Hospital Waterman, Living Disparities. I think we still have a copy of the presentation that John Owens did
A year or so ago.
About a year ago that kind of explained how the program works, and if you don't have a copy of that, I'd be happy to share it with you. We also could look to see if we can have a abbreviated description of the program from ACA or someone, if that would be helpful.
That would be wonderful.
But I would like to echo the comments made in terms of Ken's description of it, being outside of healthcare. I didn't find anything different in the way that I would have described it, but we really do just want, instead of having dollars paid to us, we're asking that the district send them to ACA so that we can participate in this other program. But the dollars that you're sending are for the documented indigent care that we are providing.
Thank you,
Fran, while you're there, can I ask a question? Okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. The TPA that you're using with Deland in Orange City, any problems with that? I mean, how does that work from your sister hospitals, from how they've administered that? Have you heard any wrinkles, any problems per se?
We talked with them. We had one conference call with them. Brad Tilton, our PFS director, has had multiple discussions with them. I'm not aware of any issues that they have with how the program works there. They have been doing it for a while, and so I think that most of the processes work out well, other than they always run out of money. You know, they have a lot more claims than they have funding for, but that's, I think on occasion I've heard where it may just take a little longer to get paid. Before they were participating in the Medicaid program, they were getting paid directly, and so I do recall some comments about they were waiting to get paid on these claims, but in this scenario, I don't think it would make a difference. you know, we're just, supporting the funding that you've already made.
The logistics has worked well.
Yes, but I think as the gentleman indicated, their system is a lot more complex than is outlined in our bill, and certainly with many more providers, it is complicates the adjudication and processing of those.
Can you address, they mentioned that there is a significant part of the dollars that they administer go to specialty care. How is that handled under our system? If an indigent comes in and requires open heart surgery or oncology services, how is that reimbursed? If the doctor doesn't work for the hospital, I mean, does he not get paid? I mean, can you address that?
That is correct, and even if we don't have any physicians directly employed by the hospital in our associated physician group, they still would probably not get paid unless they were a startup. But generally, the specialists are coordinated by We Care, and so when a patient is approved, or we have a special circumstance where a patient comes into the emergency department, the physician on call that would be handling that surgery or whatever the case is, really does not have a means of being reimbursed. In the We Care program, those that have gone through and are approved for the community clinic and need specialty care get coordinated through We Care, and they have a pool of specialists that are willing to do a certain number of cases.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Anderson?
Just want to let you know my name is Don Anderson. I'm the relatively new president and CEO of Leesburg Regional Medical Center. Sorry, all this evening. I did want to respond to a couple of those things. First of all, as far as the third-party administration issue, I guess my feeling would be that any system that works is a system that, will make work. But I heard $882,000 in third-party administrative costs. That would be almost 1/10 of the entire amount. So we prefer to do it on a spreadsheet basis that we would submit that would be audited versus using a third-party administrator because of the extremely high cost. That would be my comment. But then to the other question of how specialists are provided, I don't know how Florida Hospital Waterman does their emergency room call, but at Leesburg Regional, we compensate our physicians for the emergency department call. Many of them are paid a stipend to take call in the emergency department. So, there are some requirements under the law. To be in our medical staff, you have to take a certain amount of call, but many physicians and many specialists are compensated. So, if the monies came to Leesburg Regional, we would have to help make those arrangements to make sure that the specialists are covered for acute care.
Okay. Can you, while you're up there, you're going to regret this, maybe. With regard to medical necessity that's discussed or indicated within the legislation, has your group given any I'm sure you've had discussion about how that needs to be taken care of. Do you interpret that as being also audited? I mean, and how do you do that?
Yes, there's two different ways. There's the inpatient side and the outpatient side. But on the inpatient side, we have what's called, I'm sure Waterman can speak to this as well, but we have what's called a case management group. In other words, 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, there's a group of nurses and social workers that screen all of the cases that come into the hospital, and they are reviewed for medical necessity. And if the patient, and this is all categories of patients, so we could certainly perform a similar medical necessity review. And if the admission, there's a national standard called interqual that is the nationally accepted criteria for admissions of all types of patients. And the interqual standard book is about that thick. And we have paid experts literally working 16 hours a day in the emergency room, on the floors, and as patients come in, all patients are screened for interqual criteria, so that's the universal way. And if this were a Blue Cross or a Medicare patient and they did not meet the interqual standard, the payer would deny a claim. But that's done on an audited basis, where they will come and audit. Now, on the outpatient side, if we wanted to use a universal standard, there would be the Medicare guidelines for outpatient care. And so they call it, is it conditions of participation? Is that the right term? Yeah, you have medical necessity criteria that Medicare uses, and, we could certainly adopt those, or the board could decide to adopt those.
Is that something that would be added to the list, or that would be presented for audit?
Yeah, the way the Medicare program, I'm going to have to call it the financial people here, but the way that's done is that the patients, under the Medicare program, every doctor that submits an order for a diagnostic test must have a reason for the test that's being done. And those reasons are then correlated against the standards of Medicare to make sure that the diagnosis matches the code.
So it would be available in the support package for the audit?
I would just say if they were going to do an audit, we could certainly pull that out. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Yes, Mr. Weiner, your turn. We'll have all three hospital representatives.
Howard Weiner with Washington Behavioral Center. A couple of corrections, Ken, that'd be all right. One, we do not get paid on a DRG basis. We get paid on the prospective payment system, which is a fairly complicated formula for Medicare, excuse me. We do not participate in the matching program because it's a specialty hospital. We cannot bill patients, or we can't bill the state for Medicaid services for our inpatient unit. So that's a little different criteria. That's why when you ask me for data, I used from our Medicare cost reporter,
right,
charged to revenue.
But it sounds like very similar to at least the inpatient calculation on the acute care hospital side. They're looking at charge or payment to charge ratios for reimbursement.
No, it's actually a complicated formula. And you can have two patients staying in the hospital the same amount of time, receiving the same services, and we get paid differently because it has to do with comorbidity and other factors that Medicare is put into the formula. That's why I used it on our Medicare cost report is where I got the percentage for you.
But do you have any concerns with the documentation requirements that are been proposed?
I think I have the same ones that the hospital do, and that's really having to do with homeless. And we do receive a lot of homeless clients. But being able for client to sign off works for us, but it does pose a problem.
Right.
Again, we're dealing with people who don't have necessarily all the mental faculties together.
Right.
People who are paranoid, schizophrenic, and people like that who really don't want to. They just absolutely refuse to sign, and they know that under federal law and state law, we have to serve them and provide the same services that the person in the next bed is getting as insurance.
Well, that brings up another point that I have thought about. Indigent patients probably already know that hospitals have to provide service, and if the documentation process becomes a pain to them, they're not going to cooperate, are they? I mean, do you foresee? I mean, how different are the requirements of this new legislation to what's currently being done at each hospital? And do you think that's going to have an impact on the amount of indigents you can qualify?
We already capture that data, but again, because of the nature of our patients, the nature of the illness, it will create a problem for us because people don't come in and they're not making rational decisions. If they were, they wouldn't be.
Yeah, patients of yours.
Yeah, and remember the criteria for being admitted to LifeStream is that they're dangerous to themselves or others. And that's just a problem for us. And one we work with all third parties.
the documentation process and whether you think that's going to be more or less difficult?
I think they would have the same problems because not a large portion, but a significant portion of our clients actually come to us from
them,
since we are the only psych hospital in Kingman.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Mr. Madison.
Just to follow up, Ken Madison, Florida Hospital, Waterman. The documentation requirements erode substantially what we believe we're providing in indigent care because of the fact that patients are less likely to want to cooperate with us in documenting the requirements that are in the legislation. But we're taking into consideration that additional responsibility and the additional burden of that documentation in the figures that we provided to you. But you'll notice those figures are substantially less than what we've reported in the past as indigent care because we've done our very best to try and analyze the pool of patients that we care, some of which will never help us in the process of documenting that, but yet through processes that we've followed for a long time can determine whether they're not indigent or not. But the numbers that we've provided you are based on what we believe we can document based on the requirements of the new legislation.
Don't leave. Your turn. I think we've adequately discussed already discussed the acute care and the mental health, mental hospital aspect of it. From the licensed primary care clinic prospect or situation, I know Waterman supports a facility in Eustis, and Leesburg supports a facility in Leesburg. And those facilities would need to be reimbursed directly under this new legislation. And my understanding is that the hospitals provide a lot of that, the majority of their financial support. I don't know all there is to know about the Leesburg clinic. I think there are maybe other additional sources, maybe through the church, that may not be available to the Eustis clinic. But how would you propose, or I know the cost that you provide, well, the patients that are seen at the clinics, if there are procedures that are determined to be necessary, are they either sent to We Care or they go to the hospital? Or, one or the other, I would think, would receive them, and then you would bear the cost of the actual procedures that are performed, any diagnostic tests and things like that. But how could we help the clinic in getting dollars to the clinics? I mean, I think we had a conversation about possibly charging for an office visit, depending upon the complexity or whatever. Can you address that, please?
At Waterman, the indigent care clinic that we operate is operated as a department of the hospital. So the full responsibility of costs associated with providing that care is borne by the hospital. And at Leesburg, and I'll let them speak for themselves, but they bear the costs associated with supplies and personnel, which is probably the lion's share of the costs associated with providing that care. So in reality, any dollars that would be reimbursed to the clinics, if they could be included in dollars that we could use for matching, since we're concerned that there may not be enough tax proceeds to maximize benefits that would be available through the matching program, that you would also, any claims that we submit for primary care through the clinic, that we also have that money held to be included in what we submit to the Agency for Healthcare Administration. At least that would be our request at Waterman's.
And that was included on the numbers that you guys provided. There were 4 different buckets, I think, of cost, indigent care costs, and there is, for the board's pleasure, on the Leesburg page it shows medical ministry free clinic, and on Waterman's page it has community clinic. And you can see the dollars. There's $193,000 with support on the Leesburg side and $219,000 with support on the community clinic in those obviously, the patients there would still come under the same purview in terms of eligibility requirements and all that, so that would be an issue.
One other, to continue with the response to your question, the care that those patients would require. So, for example, they're seen at the clinic, and the physician says, you know, I really need a chest X-ray, or I need a panel of lab work done. That is sent to the hospital. The hospital provides those services, and then if the person is eligible for indigent care under the guidelines of the statute, then we would include the cost of that care associated with what we would document to you. But there is a substantial amount of money that both hospitals provide in terms of surgeries, imaging, and other diagnostics because of the patients that require that, and not just for the 2 clinics that we operate, but we also do this for others as well. It's part of why we are the safety net for the community, and why we believe that the hospitals already bear a substantial amount of the care to this community for those who are unable to pay for it.
Thank you.
Sir, Ken, I have another question while you're up there, if you don't mind. I'm like Kenny, I don't want you to leave too early. I'm certain most people in this world would agree too, if we're talking about 10% cost for this TPA, that is way out of line, and that's an absurd way to spend that kind of money. But if we are capable of getting our thing to the 4% level, or whatever it could be, and have the dollars for an administrator that we think is doable, is that the hospital see any problem with that?
We
the third-party administrator, if the costs are in line?
We would rather not see dollars spent on the adjudication of claims. We believe that there is a more efficient way of documenting to you that we are following the requirements of the new legislation. When you get involved with a third-party administrator, the adjudication of the claim, in essence, becomes an unnecessary process to document the care for you. What I'm also concerned about is that a third-party administrator, if you're not requiring the adjudication of every individual claim, is not needed for the process as we understand it in the new enabling legislation. As far as the administrative costs, it would be our desire, and certainly I believe it's your desire as a board as well, for the most efficient process by which you can meet the needs or the expectations that you have as a board, and that as little as possible be spent on the administrative side, because of the amount of indigent care that's going to be provided out there, we believe far exceeds the amount of dollars that are going to be available. But as far as us supporting the board's decision to hire an administrator or an accounting firm to help manage the process, we don't object to that, as long as it can be the most efficient that it can be. Did I answer your question?
Yes, sir, you did. Yeah, I think the TPA serves as a function also as a cost control somewhat, a little bit. I think we're all in agreement to do the most efficient method that we can, and I guess that's what this board will discuss. So we agree. I appreciate that. Thank you, sir.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, Ma'am?
Well, I don't have a question of Ms. Madison, but to go back to the grants, the matching program and that sort of thing, my vision of this new charter that we have was to provide as much care to the indigent as we possibly could on a primary care basis, especially through clinics. I've never found out yet how many clinics we really have that would be qualifying. But if we're going to do what the hospitals have suggested, my idea was that we would have more money than we're taxing if the district could get those grants. Because Because what I'm reading is primary care is the most necessary thing there is to keep the indigent or people out of the hospital, and that's where all of those expenses lie, is in the hospital. I have some other things later on that I want to talk about, but I wanted to mention those matching programs that you're talking about, because that wasn't the idea I had.
But that's what's in the legislation. That's what was included in the legislation that was enacted, so it is available. In my interpretation of that, my thought process is that those dollars, and I found this out today, and I'm going to sound like really like an expert now, the PMATF tax goes up, included in the federal dollars that are used to match the dollars that are sent to ACA by the tax district. And if those dollars don't come back here to this community, they're going to go somewhere else. And it would just be I would be dumbfounded if we didn't take advantage of that. I don't understand why we would turn our backs on, if it's $8 million that's going up there and $16 million coming back, that's an $8 million match. Why would we turn our backs on that? And we are, in fact, including primary care clinics. And this is just a first year suggestion for allocation of the funds. If in the future that we find that primary care clinics have a much greater need, this board can decide to allocate more money to them and less to the hospitals. I mean, if that big matching program goes away, it may not be quite as important to participate in the matching program. Or if that one goes away and you're stuck with LIP, which is an 8% match, I think this past year, maybe we do allocate the dollars differently. This is just a recommendation for the first year until we get a year under our belt, that we go through the process, determine how difficult it is to document the costs that were incurred by the different parties and all that. And then you can, I think the legislation actually asks for recommendations to the legislative delegation as to what changes they might make, what the board might suggest that we make to the legislation for the delegation to consider going forward. So I'm not suggesting something that's going to be written in stone, you can't change it. It can obviously be changed on an annual basis, but this is just until we figure out what we're doing, and how this thing is actually going to work. I'm sure there's going to be some tweaks to the procedures and processes that we adopt.
I like West Volusia's idea of coming to you to get a card before they go to the doctor or clinics or the hospitals. I like that idea. But also, we heard from someone in the audience last month about a request for proposal. And then I talked to someone, and they thought it would be a good idea if we did a request for qualifications, where we might get several different firms to respond to the different areas that we need to address. Don't you think maybe we should pursue that a little bit more?
But that's one of the things that we're going to discuss tonight. I mean, I'm in favor of that, if the rest of the board, the majority of the board is. The request for proposal would, in fact, include list your qualifications. Tell us why you think you're able to perform the procedures that are necessary to be performed. So I don't think we would hire a firm that has zero experience with healthcare and looking at DRGs and TPCs and all that kind of stuff.
Well, the request for qualifications could involve several different firms doing different things.
I don't follow you. What different things are you referring to?
Okay, the example that I heard was, okay, I want my lawn done, and I only have this one person that will mow, but he's not going to herbicide, and I've got to get somebody else.
Can you apply it to this situation?
I think so.
I'm asking you to.
I mean,
someone that'll look at eligibility, and someone that'll look at residency, and someone will look at medical necessity.
The gentleman from West Volusia mentioned that they had, let's go back to my notes. They have, maybe I misunderstood, but they have several different costs. Are you administering everything that you told us, the legal fees, the administration? No, you've got a third-party administrator.
And there's, of course, the board has their own attorney. We don't get,
Okay.
the board has their own attorney. We do the accounting and the administrative, but the TPA is not part of our organization. We work with them, but that's totally independent of us.
But you issued those cards that the
They issue the
clients
cards.
get.
They issue the cards.
They is who?
They is the third-party
Oh, okay,
administrator.
okay.
And they are the ones that check the eligibility. And the card is only good for 6 months, and then you have to reapply. In our
I like that idea.
our situation is probably more compelling for the users to go through all the procedures to get a card because of the primary care and specialty care services that we provide. Because if they have that card, they can go to an oncologist or, so there's a lot of benefits to having that card. And we have advocated the primary care network to try to keep people out of the ER because it costs a lot more in the ER than to manage their high blood pressure or diabetes. And that is an overwhelming condition that at the clinic, this primary care clinic, that they're trying to control. And then the other reason where we created this pharmacy is because it doesn't do them any good to go to these clinics if they can't afford the meds, to take their meds. So, we've tried to create an integrated system to keep the cost out of the ER.
There's something I thought of while he was talking, and now I don't remember what it was. But, our legislation requires that we have an office.
It doesn't require, it says may.
Oh, okay. Well, one of the reasons that was added in there, I'm sure, is because in the past we have heard from so many of our taxpayers that they don't know who we are or what we are. In fact, I gave Meredith a magazine that I got from the legal arm of the county that sent it to me for our reception area. This is, we just need to have, and not only that, but we will build up some loyalty, I would think, in our clients to the county if they have to come to our office to get our card so they can get treatment. I just like that idea. It may cost a little bit more, and we may find out that it won't work, that we don't like it, that we can change.
Mr. Jochum, you've been standing there for a while. I'll give you some time.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment on since you went through the recommended procedures, I wanted to ask a few questions. And of course, since we only got it, today? I got it today. And so I haven't had time to go trace back to some, like the sections of the bill. But I'd like to ask a few kind of questions. One is, who wrote these procedures?
That was a consolidated effort. I had information from both hospitals and from myself, from West Volusia Hospital Authority, a couple other authorities.
Who put together the final?
The actual
report?
They came from Florida Hospital Waterman.
Okay. And then, may I recommend that in the future that you have a standard that things like this come out at least a week beforehand? This came out today. I had to track down and find that Ms. Sykes wasn't in town this month, and then nobody in their office knew what to do, and finally tracked down Ms. Kersey's office to find out this information and get it today.
This was a working document that probably changed no less than probably 6 or 7 times in the last 2 weeks. And that last version was what was available on Monday. I got the last version, I think, sometime late in the afternoon on Monday. And I wanted to have a chance to do the same thing you did, go back.
You're not
and
gonna
make sure.
approve this today?
No, this is, again, this is a working document.
Okay. I want you to be a corporate auditor, and I audited group claims operations for some large companies, and just a quick comment about TPAs is that they're good, except that if they don't have their own quality assurance program, and if your providers don't, you can have situations which may not actually apply here because you're going to be approving the providers, but if you had it open to all providers, some of those providers can be rolling labs that are scam operations and everything. I learned a lot in California when I was there. But here, because you're going to be controlling who's providing the services, you're going to approve them, whether it's the hospitals or things. I think that danger is reduced quite a bit. Nothing in the bill, I didn't see anything in the bill that said that hospitals should be given the priority over this funding. In following this whole process in past meetings, it appeared to me that one of the objectives was to have competition and to have a free market position where other providers can bid or provide services, and they can be evaluated on a cost-benefit type approach. But here, you have structured it so that just about all the money is going to the hospitals first, and then maybe if there's something left, a provider might get something. And what's the reason? Is there a particular reason why?
Because they incur most of the cost, Mr. Johnson. There's $8 million on almost $9 million that was substantiated or estimated that was incurred for 2011. I don't think you're going to find a whole lot of providers out there, individual physicians, that can document $9 million worth of cost.
Well, until you go through an RFP process and see if you have providers applying for it, I would think that you should be open towards a competitive process for that. And there's been comments about how it would be more efficient to have the hospitals do it because the outside providers are going to incur like TPA costs or something like that. Well, the costs are for the same kind of services TPA provides for adjudicating claims and other things like that is internal in the hospital cost system. And so it's built in, and they keep saying their actual cost, and that actual cost may be higher than what you would get from a provider. And I think that needs to be concerned. If you are going to consider yourself to be representatives of taxpayers as far as the handling of their funds, then you need to keep that in mind. But right now, this seems to be all structured so that no matter what, all the money is going to go to the hospital.
No, that's an incorrect statement. You just said no matter what, all the money is going to go to the hospital. That's an incorrect statement.
Well, if you follow the flow, and it's been stated that the costs for indigent care exceed what your budget is, then, and the way that it's defined here is it flows from two hospitals, and then if one doesn't use their money, it flows to the other one.
In that category,
down.
Again, this is a working document. 90% has been allocated to acute care hospitals, 5% to the mental hospitals, and 5% to other primary care clinics.
Yeah.
We can come up with any kind of allocation you want, but if there's unused funds in the acute care bucket that's on one side versus the other, it would flow to the other one if they had costs that occurred that were not reimbursed.
Say that acute care hospitals should get priority on these funds? I don't
No,
remember.
but again, until someone can document that there's another source or other sources that expend those kind of dollars for providing indigent care, I have no other way to go. I mean, this was a first year recommendation, then after the fact, next year, after we have a year under our belt, one of the things that's not included in our recommended procedures is what are the criteria we use for choosing the primary care clinics, the primary care providers. I don't know what that is yet, and that was one of the things that I had on my agenda to discuss tonight. I mean, do we open it up to anybody that sees an indigent patient, or do we have a certain threshold that they have to meet before they're considered? I mean, there's a lot of different things that can be kind of thrown out there.
I think that's kind of what the bill says, you approve providers.
Right.
I guess I assume maybe you should put in there that you have to go out and get RFPs for them and handle on an equal basis. And I mean, that's my viewpoint. And I think you ought to consider it if, because the objective is that there's by the hospital or something, let them refer it that way, instead of it always going through the hospital. So that's kind of one of the points of this whole legislation.
The legislation also states that primary care clinics that don't provide duplicate services that are offered by other public health clinics. And that's something else that needs to be considered. I mean, now, someone's going to have to give me a list of what services that the public health clinics provide. That is not a requirement in the legislation for the acute care hospitals, but it is for the primary care clinics. So if the primary care clinics come to us for reimbursement and they provide duplicate services of what's offered on the public side, then my interpretation of the bill is that they don't qualify. I mean, it was reported in the news after our last meeting that we were making a mountain out of a molehill, I believe was the quote. And I don't think that's the case. And I think this discussion tonight proves that.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to give you my opinion.
Thank you very much. Dr. Etienne? I don't really want to open it up to a whole lot of public comment because we still have a lot to discuss, but Dr. Etienne, please.
I'm Dr. Albert Etienne. I'm a resident of Eustis and a taxpayer in the Northeast District, so I'm a part of the process. I wanted to just share some thoughts for the board members to consider as you deliberate. The enabling legislation dissolved the old tax district, and this, of course, is a new tax district, and therefore it's a new day and a new paradigm. And as I read the enabling legislation, it very much is focused on the medically indigent patient. It recognizes, of course, that the funds will go ultimately to the provider for rendering services to the medically indigent patient. But the medically indigent patient is indeed the focus. Let me also say that I believe that, quote, the hospital is the aggregate of all of us who are patients or customers of the hospital, and that it is us who provide the indigent care by paying full freight or what our insurance company pays, or through self-pay. I mean, it's not an abstract thing. It is all the other patients that pay for indigent care. And in my practice, which I am no longer practicing, all the other patients pay for the indigents. I just took care of everybody. I didn't worry about whether they paid me or didn't, because most of them did. I would like to speak to the allocation thing that Chairman Carpenter brought up before. I do not believe we can go down that route. It's not to say that's not where the money will end up. That it may indeed be where it goes. But I think it should be based on the claims made by the care given to specific indigents under this new paradigm. And I actually think the law prohibits going that way because it says that you cannot use the money raised by your tax for indigent care based on assumptions, models, studies, or expert analysis or opinions. And indeed, everything that has been presented tonight, scrubbing of data and so forth, going back to last year's work or the year before, does indeed involve assumptions, modeling, and so forth. And the law specifically prohibits that. However, we can go forward, and the allocations may end up being exactly the same. But I think what the board, my recommendation for the board, would be with reasonable speed, so that no indiscretions or mistakes are made, to consider both setting up either your own employees, and you'll certainly need more than 1.5. I kind of figured it would take about 5 employees to do this when I was thinking about this at home. An executive director, probably an office in Tavares and a little satellite branch in Leesburg to cover the 2 districts, and probably 4 other people that would be qualifying and issuing the cards. I too like the card system, by the way, because then the only burden on the hospital, as far as the law requires them to verify, the only burden on the hospital is that the person who presents, or the provider, I should say the provider, is that the person who presents the card is indeed the one who is indeed the rightful owner of the card. So when I go to the airport, for example, they make sure that the boarding pass says exactly what my driver's license has. And they look at me and they look at the picture. And it's a brief verification. It's a verification that I indeed am the authentic cardholder. A photo ID card, similar to what the gentleman from West Volusia has described, to me would be ideal. And whether 6 months sounds a little short, I think it'd be a lot of work to renew them every 6 months, but I'd recommend a year renewal because people, who don't have jobs then get jobs, and people who weren't married get married, and things like that. Circumstances do change. So I don't think the law permits us to use prior year's experience, but it does permit us to set up an organization, start qualifying people, let them go to the hospital or the primary care physicians who are qualified. And I think we should market this so that we reach as many. We know who the hospitals are, we know who We Care is, and we know who Livestream is. But there may be many clinics where primary care doctors who could qualify come before our staff, qualify, and be recommended to the board for approval. And by staff, I mean the staff that you hire. With respect to the RFQ process, in my role as a city commissioner, I use this. The RFQ process is elegant. It really works. You put out a request for qualifications. Usually 6, 7 firms will respond. They all sort of look alike on paper. It's glossy and looks good, but a couple don't look so good on paper. And then you have a committee who ranks maybe the top 5, and you interview them. And when you interview them, you can really tell the difference. Their past experience and so forth. And then what you do after you interview them, the committee will rank them, and you will select maybe 3 or 4 firms who you then have fee negotiations with, but you make no commitment. And then you can use one firm that has a particular strength to do one thing, maybe another firm to do another thing. So in fact, the firm that maybe, if you decide to go with outside vendors, the firm that, say, qualifies the indigent and generates ultimately their card, if they can fill out, all the paperwork, and they don't have Medicaid and so forth and so on, that would be a different firm maybe than the auditing firm or the administrating firm. You can mix and match depending on the skill sets, and you really do find different skill sets, even though the RFQ, everyone's reading the same RFQ, but what responds are companies with similar but clearly different skill sets. And it really gives you a rich resource because you have them basically at an agreed fee, but you don't have to use any of them, or you can use 1 or 2 of them or all of them. There's no commitment involved in the process. I would like to then now move on, because I know there may be other members of the public that would like to address you. I would like to move on to the matter of the audits. Of course, they're necessary by the law. I do believe that it's very important to keep a strong emphasis on what Chairman Carpenter brought up, which is the medically necessary aspect of it. Billing irregularities in the medical industry, as you know, be it a private physician or a small clinic or a large provider, are rampant. Unfortunately, the only ones we really hear about are those that make the newspaper. But when they do make the newspaper and you read the story, and the assertions and the allegations and the back and forth, usually what it boils down to, was it medically necessary? And if so, was it properly addressed? Meaning, was the service really necessary in the first place? If it was necessary, was it provided for at the right level of staff for diagnosis or testing? And then, if it was or was not, that then is the issue. And then if it was it properly coded and billed? That's where your problems are. So when you do retain a firm, whether it's through this RFQ process, in addition to a financial firm that will crunch numbers, like if there are 10,000 encounters, you might do a 10% sampling and crunch review 1,000 records. That's easy to do. I've reviewed hundreds of records over my career. There's the financial part, but then there is flipping the pages to check whether the doctor has written adequate notes and has provided the certification of medically necessary, and whether it's skilled. And I have found there are people that specialize in this. In my career, it was nurses, and then if they ran into a problem, they would call me, and I would go and audit. And it really is nothing to spend a day with 100 records and go through them. Believe it or not, you can do it. Those are my comments, and I hope you will consider them. Thank you.
Thanks. I'd like to address a couple of things that you mentioned. You don't have to say anything, but you've mentioned that the legislation doesn't allow for estimates or modeling or analysis. And I agree with that. I saw the same thing, but I don't know that this is what we're proposing is in fact that. I think the legislation also says that we can participate, the hospitals can participate in the Medicaid matching program. And that number is negotiated up front, unfortunately. I mean, in years past, last year we signed the contract as directed by the hospitals with ACA at the end of our second meeting in September. So we've got to have a number in order for them to participate in the program. We have to have a number that we're contracting with to send to ACA on behalf of the hospitals to participate in the program. We're auditing the numbers. We're advancing. I agree that we're advancing numbers or money if we're making payments based on. There would have to be some kind of an estimate, I think, in order to come up with that number that we contract with ACA. But they're subsequently documented by charges that are submitted for audit to us. And the legislation also calls for a reimbursement or a refund of costs or money, tax proceeds that are received that are not documented. So I think it covers it. And I agree with your comments that, I've heard other modeling and things like that. They're used, based on a credit score. We think that they're indigent or something like that. That's not what we're talking about. I mean, that's what I think of when I look at that particular language. I think we are in fact going to be going back and looking at specific information to document their qualification as indigent. So. All right. Can you make it brief? If you got something to add that hasn't already been said, please.
Like Calvin Coolidge, I hope this is the longest short speech that I've ever made or the shortest long speech. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tully Petrovitz. I'm a physician and have been practicing in Lake County since 1972 and served on this board for a period of 8 years until my term ran out. I understand that you have a work in progress here, and I hope that it's a labor of love. The problem that I faced when I picked up the papers yesterday late was looking at the fact that at the heart of that legislation was transparency. And transparency means that the public needs to have an early heads up on what you are considering. Otherwise, as Mr. Yoakum pointed out, it really becomes all the hospitals. And that's the way this thing looks like it is written in this recommended procedure pamphlet that you've distributed. And it's not about the hospitals. You are the representatives of the public, the tax-paying public. And it is the taxpayer that really is shouldering the burden here, and you are the ones that need to be representing that. I shouldn't have to remind you of that, my heavens. You all know that you are publicly elected. So I would hope that you keep that in mind for the future. I frankly think that public hearings on an issue that is important as this one is, involving something that is clearly in the national headlines all the time, healthcare issues. This needs to be front and center in our public's eye as well. As far as the second point that I wanted to make, and that is, I think we're putting a little bit the cart before the horse here in terms of considering all of the procedural things. With due respect for the fine presentation that we heard from West Volusia, that is really ahead of the game. We don't even know if we have an indigent health care problem and the depth of that problem. We need a study that will provide that kind of answer, and also how else it might be addressed besides through the hospitals. Back in 1993, although the hospitals were very, very reluctant to do that kind of study, we finally got enough support from the media that we did develop a health needs assessment for Lake County. I don't know if any of you have read that, but it is a document that really brought out what the characteristics of Lake County were, not only the demographics, but also what the needs were and what the resources were for the county. And as a result of that, we had two wonderful programs that came out of it. The so-called We Care program that you've heard so much about since the last time we met, and also a committee that is no longer in functioning, which is unfortunate, and which was recommended through this independent study, was a comprehensive health care committee that had brought all of the stakeholders together in the issues of health care in Lake County. The county commission was represented, the hospitals were represented, the dentists were represented, hospice was there, we had LifeStream Behavioral Center. All of these groups were there to discuss that in addition to private citizens. These were open public meetings held here in the county. Now, this kind of thing would allow you then to prudently and wisely spend the tax dollars that you have. It would give more credibility to the hospitals who are seeking help in their endeavor here. And I think that we can't afford to make this issue a divisive one. And that's what it's turning out to be. It's the hospitals versus the public. And that is bad news. So that is not going to pay off in subsequent elections. So I urge you, please give consideration to the public in this issue, not simply look for all of the answers from hospital who can provide good answers, but obviously that holds the conflict of interest flag very, very high. And I don't think you can afford to do that. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry to take any more time. Was it the shortest speech?
Yes, Roger. It was excellent.
I'm Catherine Earhart from Eustis, and I would like to echo some of the thoughts that some of the public have brought to your attention. This bill came about because the public wanted external accountability. Now, the card system seems like a good way to do external accountability. But as many of us left the last meeting that you had, we got the idea, Mr. Carpenter, that you were going to go get the script from the hospital. And we were proven correct. And you've been cautioned tonight, and we ask you to get back on track. Also, I'm a little confused about, it seems like all you're interested tonight in maximizing the grants so the hospitals can have as much money as they can from this Medicaid matching fund. That's my impression as a citizen. And I'm wondering, since the taxpayers' money is not going to be used for paying Medicaid services, how can you give all of the taxpayer money at this point in time to the state, to ALCA, to match them, to maximize them?
You want me to answer that?
I know that you, yes, go ahead.
We're not directly reimbursing Medicaid costs. It's already been stated once tonight. Maybe I didn't state it clear enough, that we're documenting indigent costs on the quarterly reports that are going to be submitted by the providers, and the hospital providers. Those funds that are supported as indigent care costs, they've asked us to send them to Tallahassee. So we're not paying for Medicaid patients. I mean, we are reimbursing them for costs incurred to care for indigent because it's required to be that way in order to participate in the program. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's clearly stated in the legislation that was passed by the...
But what's confusing maybe the audience tonight is that you keep interfacing using Medicaid and indigent as being the same thing.
No, they're not.
Well, that's what you were doing tonight. You didn't, even when you just talked, you said Medicaid and then you used indigent. Now, this bill is for indigent care. And
you obviously don't understand.
Okay.
And I'm not going to try to explain it anymore. We've had this conversation many times over the last couple of years, actually.
Okay. But the indigent care is up to 200% of the poverty level. Does ALCA have any guidelines as to what is indigent care?
It doesn't matter. The legislation says that we follow HICRA guidelines, with the exception that the income limit is increased to 200% of the federal poverty level. That is what we will administer the new law by. It doesn't matter what kind of rules that ALCA has.
Okay.
It's HICRA guidelines that we're following.
And there are some of us here that aren't interested in making sure that we get all the money we can get from the state and from the government, because we are taxpayers, Mr. Carpenter, just like you are. And we know maybe it's not coming from our local property tax, but it's definitely coming from our state income tax and our federal income tax.
It's also coming from a tax that's